All right, Brendan, before we get to Toronto, one more quick thing.
Okay.
Rotten Tomatoes. Oh boy, there was a lot of controversy this last week thanks to Vulture. They had an article out talking about the futility of Rotten Tomatoes, how it is the system that Hollywood is manipulating, and apparently there are some PR firms even paying critics to write positive reviews. Oh boy.
Oh
Where do we
gosh.
begin with this one?
Well, I guess we gotta, refund some of that money back for giving some movies a positive review. We've been found out. We've been found out.
Yeah.
Um,
Wild.
I mean, it is unfortunate. I do feel like there's not enough being talked about as far as the percentage that this may even apply to, because at the same time, I don't want us to overlook that there have been critics, especially those of diverse voices, that were
Yeah.
able to get more of an outlook or an outlet because of platforms like Rotten Tomatoes.
Yep.
And I don't want that to be forgotten. And I feel like this conversation, even if there is truth to it, which is unfortunate, I feel like it only affects a certain pocket, and especially a certain pocket of films, right? Like a certain type of film.
Yeah.
This definitely seems to be more of a finger pointing exercise at certain blockbusters from, let's say, Marvel, for instance, right? It definitely
Mhm.
seems to be very finger pointing at that in particular, but that doesn't encompass the totality of Rotten Tomatoes, if you ask me. It's also still been a very helpful tool for people like us, for critics of color, for instance,
Yeah.
female critics, and that shouldn't be overlooked either.
Well, and that's the interesting dichotomy of Rotten Tomatoes is
Yeah.
that your top critics might not need it as much, but someone like us, it's massive. It gives
Yeah.
us a platform that is much bigger than our own, and it gives us a credibility,
That's
and
it.
a
Yeah.
lot of others I know are in that same boat, and it offers those same kind of values. And yeah, there's a lot that is positive that comes with it. And as you noted, over the last, I don't know, 5, 6 years, they've opened
hmm
the platform up and they've been able to bring in a lot more diverse set of critics. And not just in terms of demographic, but types of reviews. So more
hmm
YouTube content, podcasting like us as well.
Yeah.
And of course more written content. So they've opened up and embraced the technology as YouTube and podcasting has evolved, and it's
hmm
become a form of criticism that people do listen to
Yeah.
as much as written content.
Yeah.
So the diversity of Rotten Tomatoes in that regard, I think, has offered a new perspective that I do think is very compelling. And there are so many great critics on Rotten Tomatoes through these various platforms, whether it be
Yep.
written, video, or audio.
Yep.
And I do love that. Absolutely, I do love that.
hmm
There is the other end of it, though, where perhaps some critics can be vulnerable to PR firms. And look, if you're
hmm
taking money to write reviews positively or negatively, and one could assume it's going to be positive
Yep.
if
Yep.
the critics are paying you, those people do need to be rooted out.
They do. I'm
Rotten
with you.
Tomatoes fundamentally already is at a disadvantage because it is an aggregator. It's not really reflective of quality because
Right.
it's taking an
Yep.
average
Yep.
score, right?
Yep. Yep. Yep.
So in theory, a movie could come out and everyone on the platform could give it a B minus
And it still gets
and
100%.
it gets 100%. And people
This
are
is
like, oh my gosh,
you're
100%?
yeah, you're getting into something I also wanted to talk about. I'm glad you're bringing this up, that this is kind of the dangerous thing with aggregators, just in general, right? Is that people get too focused on what does the final score end up being. Where in actuality, what I feel like we need to be doing more often, and whether it's on Rotten Tomatoes or just those of us as consumers of content, like, we should be looking at these aggregators and seeing individual reviews, seeing individual thoughts, where it's like, oh, I kind of like what that person said. I'm going to follow their work from here on out. It's
Mhm.
meant to be kind of a form of critical discovery.
Yes.
And I do
Yes.
feel like, a platform like Metacritic makes that easier because it's only like 60 or so reviews. But again, it's usually those quote unquote top critics that get the credibility to be published on Metacritic specifically. But
Yeah.
that's kind of the point of it. Like I would love
Mhm.
to see Rotten Tomatoes expand to have some kind of like filtration system to be able to see like what types
Yeah.
of voices you're really looking for certain films, because certain films call for specific voices that maybe don't necessarily have more validity, but it's a certain point
Mhm.
of view that I think are more helpful in emphasizing why that film may work for a certain demographic or
Yeah.
not. And
Yeah.
that's that sense of discovery, I think, gets lost in the scoring
Yes.
of everything.
Absolutely. But that's all that people pay attention to
Right.
is the scoring, which of course the studios take note of. And that's
Yeah.
why, because of how the system works fundamentally, why it is vulnerable to perhaps some manipulation, because
Yeah.
a studio can reach out to a critic, mostly on the fringe, is what it seems to be.
Hmm.
But it's easy to reach out to those critics to be like, look, I'm not asking you to give this an A. All you have to do is get it to fresh,
Yeah.
whatever that works for you in your grading
And the
system.
thing is,
And we
like,
use,
it's easy to target those critics, right? To target those that might be kind of at that like middle ground grade. It's just like just a slight twist, a slight convincing of give it a B minus or something.
and
Whatever's
that's the
gonna turn
main
it
thing.
into a
Like,
tomato.
regardless of the, I guess, reputation of the critic, they could be
Yeah.
fringe or even a top critic.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure it's much harder to buy the critics up at the top. But either way,
Hmm.
regardless, you could be Roger Ebert, and if the studio wants to manipulate you, all you have to do is give it that B minus. You don't have
Yeah.
to love it.
Yeah.
Just get us to the fresh, because that's all that matters in the aggregator is the
Oh,
freshness of it.
oh man, I wish I could be a fly in the wall to hear if Roger Ebert himself ever got targeted by a PR firm for that exact
I could
conversation.
only
I
imagine.
would love to hear
Yeah.
his response to
Oh
that.
my gosh, he would have had the most clever of responses. There's no doubt about it.
I feel like Gene Siskel would have had a more vocal and agitated response. He actually
Yeah.
might have been more fun to listen to being a fly in the wall for that conversation.
I mean, I, Roger's certainly been adamant about
Oh
things
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. When it comes to the
There,
purity of film and criticism, I
hmm.
think he would have absolutely been a little, not a little bit. I think he would have been pretty vocal about that,
Yeah.
which is
Actually, they
why,
all would have been because they take their job so
very
seriously.
seriously,
Yeah, like Richard Rowe
absolutely,
would have done the same thing too.
absolutely. Regardless, though, I don't want to get too bogged down in that, because
Mhm.
regardless of the critic, the problem with Rotten Tomatoes is that it's vulnerable to manipulate, because all you got to do is bump it up ever so slightly.
Yeah.
From that C or C plus to a B minus. That's all I'm asking. Here's $50. Here's $100. That's all I'm asking. And that's a free, that's tempting, because that's a free $100 to barely change your grade,
Yeah.
and to change it from what would be rotten to, again,
Yeah.
the
Into the fresh score that it's
fresh score.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it makes it even more hilarious if you ever find yourself looking at a film that maybe has, I don't know, a 95% on Rotten Tomatoes, but then you look at the average rating and it's like maybe a 5.8 out of 10. It's like, wait a minute, this makes no sense. But the way that Rotten Tomatoes works, that is kind of a possibility, right? That
Yeah.
a situation like that could happen. And it doesn't really make much sense if you actually take that final percentage at face value, which you
Yeah.
shouldn't.
Absolutely. And that's
Mhm.
why we always tend to emphasize something like Metacritic more often than we do Rotten Tomatoes. As much as I
Yeah.
love being a part of Rotten Tomatoes, it
I do too.
certainly has value
Yeah,
for all the
and
reasons we talked about earlier. But
and
Metacritic is a better system.
it's
It
a
is.
better system. It still has its flaws, if I do say so myself. I think maybe some of the scoring criteria as far as what is deemed as generally favorable reviews, like what makes a movie in the yellow versus the green, where's that cutoff? I think that could
Mhm.
be maybe tweaked a little bit going forward, because we're seeing a lot more movies nowadays get the universal acclaim at 81, that it almost makes it seem like it means nothing anymore.
Yeah.
So maybe that could be tightened up a little bit, but I do agree with you that as far as the way the system works and the ease for how you and I would use it, because we look for specific critics' voices, and it's easier to find, especially given what publication that they're writing for. It makes that platform more easily digestible, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I think the interface is certainly better.
I agree. I very much agree. Anything to add, or shall we move on to Toronto?
Oh, we can move on to Tiff. I'm excited to talk about my lady Tiff here. But
All
yeah,
right.
to your point, as we round out Rotten Tomatoes, I do still want to once again reemphasize now that it has been a positive platform for a lot of people,
Mhm.
and I don't want that to be forgotten. Despite if there's any issue here, it's less so on Rotten Tomatoes and more so on the PR firms and the way that they're twisting the arms of certain critics that are more vulnerable to this. And you're right that these critics should be removed, and eventually they might get removed. So if Rotten Tomatoes does come together and find an action to take on this, that'll be a great thing.
I agree. I completely agree. I mean, I would like to see the platform be reorganized, and
Sure.
perhaps they can add some filters to it, like you were suggesting earlier, and not just for discovery, but to weed out a higher accuracy as to what these numbers actually mean,
Hmm.
a la a Metacritic. Doesn't have
Yeah.
to be verbatim Metacritic, but just to be a little bit more emblematic of what the reviews are actually saying,
Yeah.
I think would be nice. But on the whole, I am, very much appreciative of the offer of Rotten Tomatoes,
Absolutely.
and I do think there absolutely is value to the platform in terms of discovery, and yeah, I just think just a little tweaking is all we got to do. Just got to tweak
There's
it
always a little
just a
tweaking for
little bit.
something.
Absolutely, and also shame on studios for buying reviews. What are you doing? Get out of here with that nonsense.
I'm not
We don't need
surprised,
that.
but it's
I'm not
sad.
surprised either, but still, shame on them
Still
nonetheless.
sad. Still very sad.